Welcome to the Modern Hippie podcast, where we'll be exploring all of my favorite boundary-pushing people and topics surrounding consciousness, psychedelics, mental performance, functional medicine, living in alignment, and so much more. I'm your host, Barrett Perlman, a former pro wakeboarder turned body worker, energy healer, and well, a modern hippie. And I'm so glad you're here. Welcome back to the Modern Hippie podcast. I am joined today by Liana Gillooly, who leads strategic initiatives for the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, aka MAPS, is a board chair and founder of North Star, advisory board member of Chacruna, and advisor to the Indigenous Reciprocity initiative. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so you and I met at the Marijuana Biz Conference at the Remind, which was the psychedelic business portion. And you were speaking on a panel, and I just absolutely loved your energy and loved what you've sort of been through with psychedelics. And I'm curious to learn more about you and how did you start on this path towards walking with marijuana and psychedelics?
Wow. So I think like many of us who have chosen to dedicate their lives to this movement, many of us have had personal stories of transformation. So for me, I had a lot of challenges in my youth. I experienced a big trauma when I was 14 and 17, and it led to having a really self-destructive, I would say I was very self-destructive as a teenager. I recreationally consumed psilocybin when I was 18 years old, and that single experience radically transformed my life and introduced just an insatiable curiosity around what was that experience, what just happened, how can I learn more about this? And so I've really been on that journey ever since I was 18. I first got introduced to MAPS in 2007. And I was visiting a friend, or I guess it was 2008. I was visiting a friend in Australia who was studying to become a psychiatrist. And he basically said to me, "You love LSD and you're a super curious person. You should really know what MAPS is." And I just like remember that sitting on the floor of his room and when he opened the website, right? And it really struck me. And so I ended up going to the MAPS conference in San Jose in 2010. And I like to say I've been hooked on MAPS ever since. And yeah, my journey's taken me in very many directions. I've spent time in the realm of event production, music festival production. I used to have an art gallery space in Venice Beach and would produce shows around visionary art and ayahuasca art and Burning Man art. And actually, that was kind of my first engagement within the context of MAPS and MAPS conferences, was producing art shows for their events. And then I ended up working with Troy Gayton at the ArcView Group, who is also the board chair of the Marijuana Policy Project, who is somebody I met at the MAPS conference in 2010. And so there was a lot of people came together at that San Jose Holiday Inn way back then. It was a very small event at the time. And so I just feel like I was in the right place at the right time. I was in my early 20s and I just kind of stepped in and said yes to this experience. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot more I could say about my time at ArcView, which is the largest cannabis investor network and market research firm. And the members of ArcView really were oriented in creating a new kind of industry, one that was successful and profitable, but that cared about the plant, had direct relationship with the cannabis plant, and also centered the social justice issue at the heart of this new emerging business sector. And so the early days of ArcView were really magical, filled with activists and founders and entrepreneurs and funders that were in it for what I call the right reasons. And I watched that dramatically change very rapidly. And so it was a really hard lesson for me to recognize how how naive I was at the time for thinking it was possible to build a new kind of industry. And I've since then been on this like really deep dive in understanding economics, how to build business better, and how we can not repeat the same mistakes in cannabis and psychedelics. So yeah, I ended up, we used to throw fundraisers for MAPS with ArcView members, and I ended up getting invited onto the MAPS team by Rick himself. And yeah, I've been here now for over 5 years.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And so for my listeners who aren't overly familiar with what's happened in cannabis, can you just give me a short little, maybe bullet point even of what you've seen happen in cannabis that was not what everyone expected or hoped for?
Sure. Yeah, sure. So I think the way I'll frame this is that we started out, many of us, I had been arrested for cannabis right after my 18th birthday, and spent the night in a jail in New Jersey for 0.5 grams of a stem in a bag.
No way.
And it was a really important experience for me because I felt so much injustice in it. And also, I had parents who paid for a fancy lawyer. And when I went to the courtroom, I was framed as this person who, white privileged young person who was about to go to college and had a whole future and just made a mistake. And meanwhile, there were other people in the courtroom who looked very different than I did and who were getting jail time, probation, all of these things. Meanwhile, my record got expunged, right? And so I got really curious about that. And it led to me doing a semester-long project on private prisons when I was in college at Boston University. And that research project opened my eyes to the fundamentally racist war on drugs and the history of that. And so I've come at this from that perspective since the very beginning, and I've been very motivated to end the war on drugs and to create rational, data-driven drug policies that reflect the truth, right? That reflect, so integrating responsible use of drugs and other psychedelics and decriminalizing all drugs and regulating them according to their potential harms and benefits is the foundation of my belief and my work. And so what happened within cannabis was that a lot of people were trying to do the right thing by bringing their underground businesses or semi-legal businesses above board. And the way that the regulations were written created so many barriers for entry. And even in places like in the city of Oakland, where there was equity permitting pioneered to create access to permits for people who had been disproportionately impacted by the war on drugs. It just was so difficult to do everything right, get all the permits, get all the legal, et cetera, in place, that what ended up happening is that these large, well-funded companies, often run by persons of a lot of privilege, ended up kind of becoming the leaders inside of the industry, and the people who had committed their lives to doing the right thing, running great companies, supporting small farmers, supporting women leaders and people of color, entrepreneurs, ended up losing in the industry. I mean, there's like an absolute decimation of farmers in Mendo. And, I have friends who grew a huge amount of cannabis this year and can't sell it. And so we're just seeing, I mean, there's a lot written about this. The California Growers Association, this guy Nate there, I mean, there's a lot written about this. I would really encourage people to look into this. It's very devastating what's happening right now. And so the way that the regulations were written, the onerous requirements, the huge expense that goes into having an above ground legal cannabis company and a license made the barrier of entry so high that the people who care most about the plant, who have dedicated their lives to this cause, who have risked their lives to bring people good, high quality medicine, are ending up not being able to continue to participate in the industry. And then just like there's also this like cheapening of the plant themselves, right? Like I see cannabis is a mystical, magical, deeply spiritual plant that is psychedelic in nature. there's this treating of it as just like a kind of piece of candy, right? That I get on some level, you know, I do believe in sacred celebration and the importance of that. But I think that the depth and the true power of this plant medicine to heal gets, gets tamped down. It just becomes less impactful as we commercialize it, market it. There's like a cheapening of the experience that I witness. That makes me a little sad. And also, I mean, it's very layered. And I say all of this, like also acknowledging that like way less people are going to jail for cannabis these days. And that's a very good thing. At the same time, taking groups like the Last Prisoners Project to go around to states that changed cannabis policy, and it wasn't automatically written into the laws to automatically release cannabis prisoners. So on day one of legal cannabis in California, we had thousands of people behind bars serving for minor offenses in cannabis, primarily young Black and brown men. And so these kinds of oversights and how those oversights came to be due to lack of stakeholder engagement and lack of inclusion of diverse voices in the creation of these policies, those are the types of things that I'm hoping we can do better in this next round with psychedelics.
Yeah, and what a beautifully thoughtful answer. I love how this is also just sort of that throughway of like your whole life experience and what you experienced in your arrest and having your eyes open to this disparity going on, and using that now as like your guiding light, which probably I would imagine led you to the North Star guiding principles, which you created as well, which I have signed for my participation in the psychedelics industries. And so tell us about how that led you to North Star.
Yeah, well, first the principles were co-created by, many, many voices. We had small stakeholder dinners for 6 or 7 months before we proposed any set of principles. So just want to name that was a deep collaboration with like 100 people that created that. Yeah. And so, it was interesting how it came about as well, because I did have that knee-jerk tendency to just produce something and put something out and stick a flag in the ground. And I had to really catch myself in that tendency and in that sense of urgency and slow way down and do meaningful stakeholder engagement work, which is an ongoing process in building trust, which is necessary to do things better. But yeah, I mean, for me, I had been working at MAPS for a bit, and I kind of just saw the writing on the wall. Compass Pathways had just decided to start, and they started as a not-for-profit, and they were going to pursue psilocybin for treatment-resistant depression, and then they made a switch from a nonprofit to a for-profit, and that was really the signal to me that there's an industry coming. And that like I had already lived through this like ground up emerging industry and had total front row seats to that. Like my time at ArcView was so rich. I learned so much about how businesses work and how startups work and how funders think and all the mechanics of all of that. There's something like 200 cannabis companies that receive seed stage funding through our investor network during my tenure there. So really saw a lot there. And also, I was coming out of being a person who didn't keep a bank account and who had occupied Wall Street and didn't necessarily believe in this kind of context and framework. And so a lot of gratitude to my friend Troy Dayton for inviting me into that fold and onto that ride and showing me a lot of these ropes. And so I just saw that there was a big industry that would be coming in psychedelics. And I found this original email I had sent out to a group of about 5 people in 2018, calling for kind of like a roundtable conversation on guiding an emerging industry around psychedelics. And it took a year and a half to have enough conversations, gain enough steam, and find 4 other collaborators who were all willing to hold hands and jump into the creation of North Star with me. So really want to name that it was not just like an effort that I came up with on my own. It was definitely a community that came together around these topics. I think I was the one that was just pushing like, hey, this is going to happen and things are going to get crazy. And the profit motive will distort and twist our decision making in ways that we can't
Mm.
even imagine and that are difficult to interpret and to even see because it happens on all of these subconscious levels. And so, yeah, so it's been a journey ever since then, a bit of a winding road. And we've taken a bit of time to
Mm.
really figure out how to best serve our community and our constituents and this movement. It's still really early days in psychedelics. I think that I keep having to remind myself um, that there's barely an industry yet because I know how quickly it's going to when things gel, when we start having FDA approval. Now that we have these Oregon and Colorado. Oregon has just approved its regulations. Colorado will take a couple years to create their regulations, but like the industry is coming. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as someone also in the psychedelics industry, I forget that too, because I'm like, we already have marijuana and like I'm starting a couple different companies and I hold ceremony and navigate support and integration with people. And, um, sometimes I'm like, God, am I too late? And I'm like, no, you're still really early.
Yeah, it's still really early, and the things that get cemented into this foundation will reverberate out for years to
Mm-hmm.
come. So I'm really kind of obsessed with that thought of like, what
Mm-hmm.
are we building into the foundation that is going to be holding and going to be the like firm ground that this entire scaffolding of this industry gets built upon. And so that's
Mm-hmm.
where this idea of creating a pledge, which in retrospect, I think those of us engaged with North Star today wish we called it the North Star invitation instead of a
Mm-hmm.
pledge, because it is written as this invitation. And nested under each principle are possible actions. And that was really important to us, that we didn't just put some nice fluffy words that you could greenwash your company with, but had some really solid concrete actions that you could take to express these principles, these values in the company that you were building. And yeah, I think that's like the foundation to the theory of change, is that, we're not of the perspective that we're able to stop the giant tidal wave of business as usual and its tendency towards maximizing growth and being extractive and orienting towards profit. Like that is business. This is the world that we live in, that will always exist. Our theory of change is that in this nascent industry of psychedelics, there are enough people, there's a critical mass of people who firmly understand the importance of doing things better and of prioritizing other values and principles and practices and centering what is best for the humans involved in these healing practices instead of what is best for the bottom line. And so I think there is a deep prayer in our hearts, in my heart and in the others who I am engaged with on these fronts, that there's enough of us to make a viable alternative pathway possible, right? Like there's always
Mm-hmm.
going to be the big publicly traded companies that do their thing. And the goal is that there's enough of us that when the consumer, when the individual goes to select a service, goes to select a product, and goes to make choices about how they want to engage with psychedelics, that there's a very clear option of deeply values aligned companies in the ecosystem that they can choose for themselves.
Mm, yes. And for me, I feel like it looks like the consumers are have a different profile than the marijuana consumer did when marijuana went legal. And for me, that profile sort of looks more like people who are concerned about their overall well health, their overall like healing journey. They're healing their traumas, integrating their traumas and their experiences, and approaching psychedelics in a less of a like party or just casual setting, and really seeking to approach it more in that deep healing medicinal way. How do you see the psychedelics consumer?
I see that. I don't think that it's a given that every psychedelics consumer is showing up with that same kind of orientation. I think
Sure.
that we do somewhat tend towards taking that for granted, and that it would
Mm.
behoove us to recognize that people are showing up to these substances and experiences with all kinds of intentions, right? And so
Yeah.
it's hard to categorize. But I also just want to name that I do have a concern about the kind of wellness cultural framing of psychedelics. There's Maslow's hierarchy of needs famously places self-actualization at the top of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
Before he died, he actually added a new top of the pyramid, which most people don't realize, which was self-transcendence, which is to actually get out of the kind of somewhat narcissistic self-obsession with one's own journey and one's own process and path, and to transcend that and actually become meaningfully engaged with your community, your society, with taking action around climate, with participating in governance, with participating in helping your neighbors and being part of your families. And so there is this, I am aware that there's like this really self-focused tendency within the wellness culture that I see coming into the framing around psychedelics that has me raise eyebrows and just look at with caution, and not to say that it's all bad, right? Like it's important for us, like the most important relationship we will have in this lifetime is the one that we have with ourselves. And that's totally worthy of our attention. It's just when people get into the kind of chasing peak experiences and always wanting to go one more loop up the spiral in their realizations and connection with divinity and all of these things, and there's kind of like competitive ayahuasca drinking and competitive healing. And like, I don't know, I notice these things, at least in my community. And so I think it's important to pay attention to that, to recognize that on the other side as well, there's kind of like a framing in the medical context, which I think is super important in demonstrating the true medical value and showing very rigorous scientific data around the use of these substances. Like that's incredibly important. But people tend to think that like us at MAPS are really only focused on the medical. And we have MAPS owns the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation pharmaceutical company, which is a wholly separate organization. So our pharma company that does the drug development and does the MDMA assisted therapy trials, which have just completed phase 3, is separate from the MAPS nonprofit, right? So we have two separate entities, and I work on the MAPS nonprofit side. And our mission is to create safe and legal contexts for people to experience the beneficial uses of psychedelics. And that can look like a huge variety of ways, right? From drug policy reform to expanding the definition of churches, to, for spiritual growth, for cognitive liberty. I mean, there's so many directions that people can go in for celebration. So just want to name that I don't want to like limit in like the Western medical framework the uses of these substances. Sure. I actually think there's not. These experiences are hard to put in any box neatly, which is something that's so special about them. But yeah, I think that the consumer in general of psychedelics, like my hope is that like the number one thing that I hope anyone who's approaching these experiences can hold is a sense of deep reverence for what these materials are and what these experiences can mean in their lives. And I have that similar concern that I named earlier with cannabis, which is that the more we commodify these substances, the more that we have the intention of microdosing LSD to be more productive in our work, to make more money, that there is like a very direct correlation. Like there is an aliveness to the spiritual energies that are within these transcendent states. And I have this like message in this sense that the more we commodify that, the depth of these experiences, our ability to truly touch divinity will diminish and decrease. And so I think it's really important, that we hold these experiences as sacred and with an incredible amount of reverence and respect. And also with an incredible amount of acknowledgement of the indigenous cultures, that even if we're working with lab-derived substances like MDMA, our knowledge of how to dial in and engage with non-ordinary states of consciousness is directly inspired by what was learned from Indigenous practitioners and communities. So just naming that as well as a really important piece of this is benefit sharing with these communities that have held these practices with incredible reverence for generations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's so beautiful how they carried it throughout time and, struggled through, I'm sure, prosecution themselves, but continued to carry that medicine so that we can all now benefit from it. And just what a great service that was to humanity, and honoring them and how we can help them moving forwards to not lose those traditional practices.
Very complex, and yeah, it's really a challenging topic, and it is extremely worthy of anyone who is seeking to work within this industry to have a direct line of benefit sharing back to these communities.
My lawyer is Ariel Clark of Clark Howell, and she's really been yeah, she's amazing. And I had her on a couple episodes ago, and so she's really been instilling in me more of that benefit sharing, and what is it, growmedicine.org, that she
Yeah,
likes to donate to. I've
yeah,
started donating to as
yeah,
well.
yeah, it's great.
So I'll have that linked up in the show notes again as well, if anyone would like to donate. And I wanted to read to you my North Star pledge,
Please, I'd love to hear it.
to give people an example of what these principles are. So, I pledge to learn from psychedelic medicines and use them to go deeper into my own practice of self reflection and healing. By deepening my awareness of self, I will remain open to difficult conversations and honest dialogues in supporting others ethically through the plant medicine space on their own journeys. I pledge to make the process as important as the outcome, letting the future I hope to see guide the approach I take in getting there. I vow to honor the history of the medicine and the beautiful cultures that maintained and carried their practices throughout time. May my work always reflect my values for ethical practices, equality, justice, love, and light.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah,
Thanks.
the process is the outcome. I have to give props to Adrienne Marie Brown and her book, Emergent Strategy, which was a huge inspiration for many of us engaged in the process of creating this pledge. And this idea of the process being the outcome, like how we do one thing is how we do everything. And she calls it small is all, right? And I think that's so important for us to remember that, psychedelics are deeply relational. And so we're all stepping into stewarding this industry. So how we are with each other and building our relationships and moving at the speed of trust and having open and honest and clear dialogue and showing up for difficult conversations. I mean, you nailed so many of them. That's really how we engender a culture of exquisite care in how we approach stewarding this these medicines and these plant teachers forward. So that's really great.
Yeah, and you touched on one of my favorite things just then, which is moving at the speed of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really important concept to, if anyone hasn't, started identifying that in their own lives, to begin to identify that with everything, you can really only move at the speed in which you trust the other person, in which you trust yourself, you trust your own abilities. What an applicable term that is across all spectrums of life.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah. I
so
think
I'm
that's
curious.
really, yeah, just one thing. I think that's really where I've landed in a lot of the work these days is to like build cooperation and collaboration over competition, right? Understand that we are truly all in this together. And those of us who are showing up in this time and dedicating our lives to this, like, aren't going anywhere. And so, how can we create an opening, inviting, warm atmosphere to talk about the hard things and to start to hold one another accountable? And what might that look like to be in that kind of community with people that are building companies that are directly competing with ours, right? Like that's a really interesting area for me. And I've become just really oriented towards, just being a sounding board and an ally to anyone who's brave enough to put their hat in the ring and try to make this work, try to bring this work to more people and create more healing in the world. And it's a shift because I think I started out in a really skeptical place and feeling really nervous about people's intentions and people showing up, wanting to do big things and with a huge amount of resources and with very, teams. And so it's been a big process for me as well, just that recognition of the importance of the relational side of this work.
And so tell me a little bit about what MAPS has done now with MDMA. It's probably one of the psychedelics I get to talk, well, that and ketamine that I talk about least on the show, but I love them both. And I have experienced the power of MDMA myself in that healing of traumas, and sat with others as we dove into their experiences that they got to revision and re-navigate in that beautiful lens that is the open-hearted space of MDMA. So what has MAPS learned from their MDMA trials, and like what has that translated into what you've learned from these trials with MDMA? It's such a beautiful medicine.
Yeah, so I think early on there was signal that MDMA could be extremely effective in the treatment of trauma and of post-traumatic stress disorder. Rick Doblin has spoken extensively about how MDMA was made illegal years after the rest of the classic psychedelics were made illegal in the Controlled Substances Act. And so there was a period of time when MDMA was used therapeutically by therapists prior to being made illegal in 1985. And so I think that Rick had a really good sense that this could be profoundly impactful for trauma. There's some basic mechanism of action understanding around the effects of MDMA on the brain, the reduction of activity in the amygdala, which is the fear response, the fight or flight response, while under the influence of MDMA, the ability for people to talk about difficult material without having that fight or flight reaction in their body. And so it allows for the traumatic experience to be reconsolidated and integrated in a different way without that kind of response attached to it. And so in our first of 2 phase 3 trials, we published the results in Nature Medicine. We found that 2/3 of people after the treatment round, it's about a 3 to 3.5 month treatment window, where people are treated. There's 12 90-minute preparation and integration sessions. And then interspersed, there's 3 8-hour, 6 to 8 hour, we call them day-long MDMA therapy sessions with 2 trained therapists inside the room. That's the study design. And so we found that in the 6-month follow-up, 2/3 of people no longer met the criteria for PTSD diagnosis, and that 88% of the volunteers in the study experienced a clinically significant reduction in their PTSD symptoms. And these are just really remarkable results. PTSD is a condition that people tend to live with for a very extensive amount of time. I believe our average number of years suffering with PTSD in our population was around 14 years. So people on average had living with PTSD for 14 years. So this is just like a really significant study across the entire world of trauma and has gotten a lot of attention from trauma experts and practitioners, psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists that all work with PTSD patient population. And so, yeah, I mean, it's just been super profound. We've completed our second phase 3 trial. We just made a public announcement that the results were, that we were able to reproduce the results from the first. And I can't really say more about that. The details are forthcoming and will be published in a peer-reviewed medical journal in a couple months. And so there'll be more about that soon. But what this means is that we're on track with preparing to file what's called a new drug application, and which is the final step that is required by the FDA to to have them regulate a new drug or a new therapy protocol, which this is a drug plus therapy protocol. So yeah, and that's really, that's the work of the MAPS Public Benefit Corporation, which, I work for the nonprofit side. So there's a whole bunch of people on that team that can speak in way more detailed ways about that work.
Well, maybe I will connect with some of them, but
Yeah.
it's so beautiful what's been happening around MDMA and all of the psychedelics, really, because kind of like yourself, I stumbled into psilocybin and at a time when I was just about getting ready to kill myself,
Mm-hmm.
and figured I had these mushrooms and I'd take those first, and if not, that's where I was headed.
Mm-hmm.
And it revolutionized everything for me in just one journey of learning how to love myself for the very first time in my entire life. And just like you, I was like, what the fuck just happened? And how do I started taking it then at least monthly in my room by myself, sometimes in bed with the covers over my head, just going through whatever came up for me that time. And acknowledging how just the shifts were happening, and
Mm-hmm.
problems that I had and judgments and things that I hadn't forgiven myself for were getting released and reframed. And I completely revolutionized who I am as a person, and this beautiful metamorphosis for the better.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious.
Yeah, I was just saying, it's just incredible. Like, so many of us who are on this path have had similar experiences that you and I have had. And I'm really touched by that. And I'm really touched by the potential of just what it might look like if we lived in a society where people were truly in love with themselves and in love with life and felt like they knew how to be in loving, intimate relationships with one another. And I think that's just something that drives me and motivates me, is that curiosity around what might the world be like if we were more in touch with that.
Oh, that's going to drive me and motivate me now too. Like, what a beautiful image of the world if people love themselves enough that they can walk around and love everyone else. Like, I
Mm-hmm.
love to sort of walk around and just envision that everyone is like my best friend. Even
Mm-hmm.
everyone I don't know, they're my best friend, and they're just a friend I haven't made yet. And so I just hold love in my heart for every single person I interact with. And so not to say I'm walking around on rainbows and unicorns all the time, but my interactions with people are just such a different color than what I hear from many other people. And yeah, it makes me wonder, what are the psychedelics that have really spoken to you the most? What do you tend to turn to in your toolkit?
Yeah, I love that question. So I've been through different phases, right? Like, I've been,
Mm.
since I was 18, I'm 35 now. I've been very engaged in my practice. I will say that one thing I like to share is, like, people, I'm like part of MAP. And so people assume that, like, oh, you must have done healing through psychedelic assisted therapy. And in truth,
Mm.
I did a lot of the figuring myself out, taking LSD on a dance floor in the Mojave Desert under the full moon, which is a practice I did nearly every full moon for 5 years. And
Sweet.
so that was a really potent and powerful and enlightening time of my life. I am still really partial to LSD for a lot of reasons. And I actually have a group of elder women in my life that have been holding this work for, some cases, 40 or 50 years. And I was with a group of them recently, and this question got asked to like 5 of them. They all said LSD, and I thought that was so interesting. And I feel that very similarly. I will say as well that besides that, I've just really, in the past 5, 6 years, have deepened my relationship with ayahuasca. And the space of ceremony around that is one that's just been very, very rich for me. And I just think that medicine is just so powerful. And it's also incredibly intense. Like, it is definitely not the the first thing I would recommend going for on anyone's journey. But I have a lot of reverence and respect, and I have had so many life-changing, profound revelations through that work. And I find the ceremony setting at this kind of later phase of my life to be where I spend most of my journey time, in that super deep, intentional, and active prayer frame of working with these medicines.
Mm. Yeah, I know so many people who do turn to ayahuasca for their first one, and I like so deeply honor that. Like, I've been to
Yeah.
Peru twice in the last 6 months, and the amount of times I'm meeting someone there who like really hasn't done anything else, and this is their first, and I'm like, okay, I'll check on you.
I just think MDMA is a great first experience for anyone, right? Like it's
Mm,
generally non-hallucinatory. People stay pretty much in their bodies, have their wits about them, but it creates an access point to a non-ordinary state that I think is a really great introductory experience. So I'll name that, and cannabis as well, of course.
right,
Um,
right.
yeah, yeah. I also find that ayahuasca is very jealous, and so when I'm deep in that work, there's kind of like no space for other kinds of experiences, at least in my life. Yeah.
Mm. I've actually found that psilocybin plays very well with ayahuasca because
Mhm.
psilocybin's the main one I work with. And on my big ayahuasca retreat in October, I was just in the depths of this full blown unlocking of all the source code everywhere. And the psilocybin came to me on ayahuasca and had a conversation with me about
Ooh.
surrendering to this path of sharing plant medicines and helping people
Mhm.
heal and to stop worrying about money, to that everything in my life was about to shift. So I'm also a massage therapist and energy healer, which was primarily the bulk of my income, I guess, where I spent my time. And as soon as I got back, it just magically shifted. And all of a sudden, there were all of these different psychedelic clients coming into my peripheral, and my breath work took off. And
Mhm.
it was a really interesting thing. And so even my shaman was like, "Oh, how did that feel to have psilocybin there?" And he, when you really look at their molecular structure, psilocin breaks down. But psilocin is just one little tiny molecule different from the DMT of ayahuasca. So
Yeah. Yeah.
to me, they're like brother and sister.
Yeah.
But
There's a deep
ayahuasca.
relationship there. Yeah, I also share too that for my first several years of being on this path, I only worked with psilocybin, and I
Mm.
also did not. There's this website Erowid. Are you familiar with Erowid?
Oh yeah, yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, I love shouting out Erowid. So many people who are new to psychedelics are not aware of the completely incredible resource that is Erowid.org. Way back in the day, the recommended dose of psilocybin for Erowid was 3.5 grams. And so my
Mm.
first like maybe 7 psilocybin journeys, I consumed 3.5 grams with the thinking that it wouldn't work if I had any less. Like that was how much was needed to activate. So I had like pretty heroic doses for like all my first journeys. And yeah, I have so much deep gratitude and reverence for that work. I mean, yeah, it's interesting to see the way that life has flowed and moved forward and through me. But I feel like I've spent time with quite a few of these different medicines, and it feels like it's just phases of my life. Like I kind of moved through, and I'm of this place now where I'm very infrequent with my use. I've spent time
Mm.
when I used these substances and had these experiences with a lot more frequency than I do these days. And I think that's also just a sign of my own maturation in my process. And yeah, there's kind of this other thing that Alan Watts said, which was get the message, hang up the phone, which is to
Mm.
say that a lot of people just are continually seeking the messages. And I feel like, especially the past 2 years of my life, I've been in the space of like very deeply integrating the huge amount that I've gained into the practices in my everyday life.
Mm. And that integration is just absolutely so key, like paying attention to what came up, what that message means, and how you continue to keep using that word integrate, but how you can make those changes in your own life to honor what came up and not let the
Mhm.
message go to waste, essentially, how it can improve
Yeah.
you.
I mean, I've started to say that the drugs are not the point. And like, trust me, I'm a huge fan of and I use the word drug. Some people are like, you mean medicines? Like it's all interchangeable to me.
Sure.
But yeah, like that the substances themselves are not the point, right? The point
Mm-hmm.
is how can we meaningfully change our lives for the better, right? And that happens in integration. And it's an area of this work that's understudied, under resourced, that there's like, a lot of different ways to do it. I think what I see a lot in people practicing and serving these medicines and facilitating these experiences now, it's a complete de-emphasis of integration, right? People go down to Peru,
Mm.
they spend 10 days, and then they never hear from the retreat facilitators again. And I think that like it's hard because it's more expensive to do it right. But I cannot emphasize enough that like the integration is where it is at. That is where you can harvest everything that you gain from these experiences and figure out how to build a different life in such a meaningful way that, the need to continually turn to these experiences might get reduced over time.
Hmm. Yeah, it's beautiful. And I love hearing you say that. Something I'm launching in the next month and a half is an integration community, a
Mm-hmm.
low ticket offering that people can come and join weekly lives to discuss what they've been through and be provided with resources and lots of different resources and how to navigate what they saw and how to take that and implement it moving forward. So
Mm-hmm.
really looking forward to being able to offer that for, like you said, what's kind of an underserved part of the plant medicine community.
Totally. Yeah. It's underserved. And in my opinion, it's where all the juicy stuff is. It's like where all the change happens.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm so bummed. We're kind of getting to the end of the time that I have
Mm-hmm.
you for, and I just want to quickly ask: is there anything that you're super excited about moving forwards that we didn't get a chance to talk about, or um,
Yeah. I'll mention two things. One is that North Star has launched communities of practice. We have our first community of practice, and it's with people who serve the corporate social responsibility or the what's called ESG, environmental, social, and governance roles within their psychedelic companies. So it's people whose role it is to ensure that the company they work for is being held accountable to the values that they are aligned with. And that's
mm,
been going really well. We meet monthly. It's a very high level, and yeah, there's a lot of mutual learning happening in that. Another thing too is that we're about to release a business guide, and this is a North Star Psychedelics business guide, and it's just chock full of information on what we mean by building businesses differently. What are the types of governance structure and what kinds of funding terms and mechanisms, and what are some alternative ways to operate and to own companies and to receive funding, and just like really gets into a lot of those frameworks. We also have a very robust resource list that includes things that like books and podcasts and things and articles, as well as descriptions of some of these core concepts. It also has a listing of lawyers and business consultants that we recommend companies to work with who want to implement into their governance and into their corporate structure and design these sorts of principles. So that's already available on our website, northstar.guide. Also, just name, I'll be speaking about these things at South by Southwest on March 12th. And the thing I'm really most excited about is that MAPS is producing a very large conference in Denver, Colorado in June, really like June 19th to the 23rd. And we're hoping that everyone comes. And I'm getting really excited about what we're planning for that.
mm. That's all super wonderful, and I will have those links linked up in the show notes. And is there any way else that my listeners can keep up with you or follow you on social media? Where do you hang out?
Yeah, I'm occasionally post to Instagram at Liana Sananda, and then you can find me through Maps. Anyone who emails askmaps@maps.org can find their way to me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. You've been an absolute pleasure, and I completely honor your journey and the work that you're doing to help make this world a better place.
Thank you so much for including me. I didn't get to say this, but I love the title of your podcast, The Modern Hippie. As somebody who's always identified as a hippie who grew up in a decidedly not hippie family out on the East Coast. So really, I love that frame and feel really grateful to have spent this time together.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and review this podcast wherever you're listening. I'm so grateful to have you on this journey with me. Until next time.